Greetings citizens of the world, citizens of the internet, and all participating members. We are anonymous. Venezuela's social unrest is sending seismic waves across the globe, shaking the international community. What began as a series of peaceful protests led by students on Youth Day has turned into a violent battle between anti-government protesters and government forces, as well as pro-government vigilantes. Since the conflict's eruption, more blood has been shed, freedom of the press has been slashed, and diplomats have been expelled. This is concerning to global leaders and human rights activists alike. As Ukraine erupts in flames, Venezuela is going black, as media bans and potential expulsions threatens to cut the country off from international view. Amidst the controversy and confusion, here are the 9 things you need to know about Venezuela right now. 6 people have been killed since the protests erupted, making them some of the deadliest in the country's history. Among those killed are students, the brother of a ruling leader, and a young beauty queen. President Maduro's forces took CNN's cameras from reporters at gunpoint after the network aired coverage of the Venezuelan protests and the brutal backlash by government forces. President Maduro now is threatening to expel CNN. Former mayor Leopoldo Lopez has become the charismatic face of the Venezuelan uprising, but controversy surrounds him. Some argue Lopez's politics do not align with the goals of the protests, calling his leadership a staunchly right-wing. For example, leaked US diplomatic cables reveal concern over his politics. Former Chacao mayor Leopoldo Lopez has become a divisive figure within the opposition, particularly since his very public split with UNT in September. He is often described as arrogant, vindictive, and power-hungry, but party officials also concede his enduring popularity, charisma, and talent as an organizer. PJ's Pond said she had worked for Lopez when he was mayor and was impressed by his ability to organize his staff and effectively implement programs. Nevertheless, she said he summarily fired her when her husband opposed Lopez during an internal party conflict while he was still a member of PJ. He has since been arrested by the Venezuelan government and awaits trial on a number of charges. International organizations, as well as the US government, have denounced his arrest. The excessive use of force, murder of protesters, and detention practices of Venezuela's police forces have global human rights activists and anonymous as well very concerned. Rupert Colville, the spokesman for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, talked with reporters in Geneva. In addition, some protesters have reportedly been detained and may be prosecuted on terrorism charges. It has also been reported that some protesters, including minors, are being denied contact with family or lawyers, said Colville. Pictures on social media sites shows young students handcuffed and forced to kneel at a police station have sparked outrage. Additionally, the regional representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in South America has called on the Venezuelan government to ensure that the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly. President Maduro has banned public protest and enacted a nighttime curfew. Venezuela's insanely high inflation rate has driven up the cost of basic resources, making items like flour, gasoline, and toilet paper difficult, if not impossible to get. At the same time, jobs and pay rates have been steadily decreasing. These economic issues remain some of the loudest grievances of the protests, along with calls for a more democratic government and an end to the abuse on humanity. President Maduro ordered that 3 American embassy officials leave the country. He accused them of recruiting students to participate in the protests. The demand means increasingly strained relations for Venezuela and the US. In this photo, Kelly Keelerling of the US Embassy speaks at a press conference after her and 2 other diplomats were expelled by Maduro. The Venezuelan government banned access to Twitter images and continues to vilify anti-government protesters on state-owned television. Formerly dissenting media outlets have gone quiet, prompting fear of what citizens call a complete media blackout. Student protesters are urging citizens to march in peaceful protest in the wake of the country's escalating violence. Before pro-government vigilantes reportedly started firing at students, the anti-government protests had been largely peaceful. President Maduro has recently called for peace dialogue with protesters in a countrywide speech. "We have to be builders of peace," he stated. As places to protest disappear, citizens meanwhile continue to call for his resignation.
Leopoldo Lopez has led an opposition movement against President Nicolas Maduro's government, which has been running the country into the ground. Since taking over for the deceased Hugo Chavez in April 2013, Maduro has led Venezuela to 56% inflation rate and a 50% increase in the budget deficit, prompting China to cut back on its $20 billion loan, and Moody's and Standard & Poor to downgrade Venezuelan bonds to junk status. Additionally, the once-strong dollar has dropped from an 8-to-1 exchange rate relative to the US dollar at Chavez's death to a disastrous 87-to-1. In response, Maduro has taken to blaming US-backed fascists and the parasitic bourgeoisie. He has also called for more state intervention. This has only made things harder for the private sector, which has since made it nearly impossible for Venezuelans to get food and other basic material necessities. Consequently, people like Lopez have been leading dissatisfied Venezuelans in protest. But it wasn't until Venezuela's Youth Day that things really took a bad turn. Swarms of young people, mostly aged 18 to 25, took to the streets to peacefully protest Maduro's poor governance, but state police quickly tried to corral them. At least 3 protesters were shot dead, and many more were injured. Maduro has since charged Lopez with terrorism and murder for inciting the riots where Maduro's government killed people. Since then, more young people have protested Maduro's government and the awful treatment of the Venezuelan people, especially the young people who have died during these demonstrations. Because of the government's tight control of the news outlets and television networks, very little coverage has seeped out of the country. Young people have been using Twitter and other forms of social media to organize, but the government's crackdown on dissent has been swift and severe. Maduro and his many arms of government have sworn to put a hard stop to these protests and opposition groups. But the situation is spiraling further and further out of control. As Business Week points out, the last time Venezuela experienced such aggressive instability was during the 1989 Caracazo riots, which led to the regime change that placed Hugo Chavez in power. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. To President Nicolas Maduro, you will be expecting all of us.